Okay, in this lesson, we're going to take our first look at mixing. Mixing 101 will deal primarily with balance, which is one of the goals of mixing a song, is that you want to have the appropriate balance between all of those sounds that are in your project. Mixing is one of those kind of art forms and sciences within the craft of audio engineering. You have to understand the science of it all and the tools and techniques, but there's also an art form to it that comes over time and really comes over experiencing different projects and different observations that allow you to actually develop your ears. So, what is audio mixing? Mixing is the process by which multiple sounds are combined into one or more channels. In the process, the source's signals level, frequency content, dynamics, and panoramic position, that's basically panning, are manipulated, and effects such as reverb may be added. So, in that initial recording, when you first record a band or you first record an individual, there probably aren't any effects. There isn't a lot of processing. You're just basically trying to capture that sound the best way you can. But mixing begins that process of thinking about EQ, thinking about compression and panning, and thinking about effects and all of those types of variables. Mixing is practiced for music and film and television and also live sound. The process is generally carried out by a mixing engineer operating a mixing console or a digital audio workstation or DAW or DAW. The ultimate goal is to create a sonic product that accurately represents the recorded or live performance. And you also want it to be appealing to your listeners. That's going to be very important. A good mix also has to be portable because people listen to music over a wide range of mediums. They might listen in their cars, at a club over loudspeakers. Many people have, iPods and iPhones, so they're listening with their earbuds. People listen over computer speakers and Bose systems and all different types of speakers. So it's important that your mix translates well over this wide range of listening mediums. And that's what the word portable means, that mix is going to translate from one system to the next. The focus of mixing a project is to achieve balance among the sounds that exist in that project. Prior to processing, which when I say processing, I mean adding compression and EQ and effects, one technique that's used is to start achieving that balance with the sounds in the mix. So before adding any type of effects, you start to just use the volume. Use the volume to get your balances set and try to get generally a good sound or balance between all of those sounds that you have in your mix. Volume balance is generally achieved by setting the individual levels of each sound. So on each track, there's a volume fader. And that fader you basically can lower or raise based on how loud you want that individual sound to be. And you want to achieve that so that the groove of the song and the energy level and just the sonic priorities of the mix are representative of the performance that's been captured and also of the genre of the project. So as you're recording a certain performance, you're getting a feel for the overall energy of the song. You're getting a feel for which instruments or sounds should be in the forefront and which instruments or sounds should be in the background. And so when you're achieving that volume level, you're keeping all of that in mind so that you set each level appropriately. So achieving balance in a mix can be difficult if individual tracks have inconsistent volume levels. And when I say inconsistent volume levels, I'm talking about excessive amounts of dynamic range throughout the song. So if you have a certain track that's basically getting loud and then soft and then loud and then soft, it's going to be hard to set that individual sound in the mix so that it is consistent throughout the entire song. Now, some song arrangements call for different levels of dynamic range in certain sections. So sometimes a verse might have a lower volume than a hook, or a bridge might get much louder or change in dynamics based on that section of the song and the arrangement. Now, that type of dynamic range is okay because typically all of the instrument levels will increase or decrease in those sections. It's not just one part or one instrument that's kind of varying. It'll be like the entire musical arrangement will call for all of the instruments to vary in volume. So that type of dynamic range is fine. But dynamic range of in individual instruments or sounds that aren't a function of song arrangement can be problematic. So if you got that one sound that's just loud in some places and soft in other places, that can be a problem for a number of reasons. Number one, it can be difficult to find the appropriate volume level throughout the song for that part. If it's going up and down, it's hard to place that song at a certain volume level and keep it there, because at one moment you think you got the volume right, the next moment you got to turn it down because all of a sudden there's a volume surge, and vice versa. Another reason this can be problematic is because it becomes more challenging to employ some processing tools. So there might be some processing tools that, for example, compression, that you're setting that compression level to contain or control dynamic range, and you get your compression set just the way you like it with the appropriate amount of gain reduction, and then all of a sudden there's a certain section of the song where it gets loud. So that setting you made now kind of throws off the amount of gain reduction that you were looking for in that compressor. So if you want to employ some processing tools, you got to make sure you got an adequate volume level to really set that accordingly. If multiple instruments have an issue with excessive dynamic range, then the mix will be inconsistent in various sections. So if you got, 2 or 3 instruments that are just kind of up and down, in their own, unique ways, then it really becomes difficult to have just a consistent mix all the way around. It can be really difficult to contain and control your mix. And then ultimately, once you think you've got balance, you have to readjust if there's a lot of dynamic range in your individual instruments or sounds. So one of the keys or one of the tools or techniques that's used to address excessive ups and downs in volume level on individual tracks is multing. And multing is basically splitting an individual part, right? An individual track into multiple tracks based on noticeable changes in volume levels throughout that track. And as an engineer, you have to make a choice as to what tools you're going to use to control a dynamic range. And multing, again, is just one of those techniques. So let's take a quick look at an audio track, okay? And this is a waveform here that's been recorded. And as you can see, it has a certain volume level here in the beginning. And then all of a sudden you can see through these transients. And what a transient is a sudden increase or spike in sound output that occurs for a short period of time. So these transients give you a good indication of what's going on in certain sections. So you can see in the beginning it's kind of quiet. Then you have these surges, these transients that are obviously much louder. Then the volume goes down, and then all of a sudden the volume gets loud again. So this could be a good candidate for multing, where you would break these sections of this track that get louder and put them on their own track so you can control the volume of those individually. So we take a look, you can see through this red bracket that there's a section in the beginning where it has its own unique volume. And then there's a section here towards the middle that has its unique volume. And then obviously in the beginning, the song starts out fairly quiet. So if you're trying to actually mix this particular sound, it could be quite difficult. All right, so multing would allow us to basically, if you look at these dashes here, to take the sections of the song that really appear to be unique in their own way, split them, and basically put them on their own tracks. And this gives you the advantage of being able to have consistency because you can control the volume of these individual components on their own. So now we're going to take a look at multing in practice via Pro Tools. Okay, so let's take a look at the AMS All-Stars project. This first project for the in-studio production and recording students here at ldb10.com. So as we look at this layout set up in a Pro Tools session, we see that there are a number of individual audio tracks. And if I go down the left side, you can see you have the kick, you have the snare, overhead 1, overhead 2, guitar, bass, and then you actually have a guitar 2 as well. So, regardless of the session that you're working on, you do want to take a look at those individual tracks that you have when you start looking at trying to get a good balance when you're mixing. So let's start out by just taking a look at this kick track. And as we look at the kick track and we look at this waveform here, which is the graphical representation of a sound wave, we see that there's a fair amount of dynamic range. So in this section of the song, you have a certain volume level for the kick. Right in here, we get a different volume level for the kick. And then even another volume level right after this high peak. And then towards the end, we get another volume level. So as we stated when we're discussing multing and we're discussing balance, if I was trying to get a consistent level for this kick throughout the song, I would have a few problems when I came to these areas that were, a little bit louder or a little bit softer than other sections. And so this is going to be one of the advantages of multing this track out, so that we can take these louder sections or these sections that have different volume levels and just put them on their own individual tracks. That way we can deal with their volume independently. So why don't we start with the kick? And again, looking at Pro Tools, as you know, we have a transport bar. This is our stop, play, and record, and fast forward and rewind. It also gives us an idea of our song position. So your transport bar is basically your, remote control, for lack of a better word, of a session. All right. And if you don't see this transport bar, this floating transport bar, you can hit window up here at the top and just click transport. All right. So that's how you can toggle that transport bar on and off. So let's get started with some multing. If I click down in this track, and again, it's important to have a good idea of how to use these toolbar keys here. And right now I have this smart tool on, which gives me the combination of a grabber tool, a selector tool, and a trim tool. So if I look at a track, I can imagine that this track is being divided into two halves, a top half and a bottom half. So if I have my smart tool selected, what that allows me to do is when I'm in the bottom half of that track, I have the grabber tool, which allows me to grab an entire clip. If I'm in the top half of a track, I see the selector tool, which has a completely different icon. So it's important to know, depending on what, side of the track you're on, top or bottom, what icon is available. So if I'm in this top part, I can grab the selector tool and kind of zoom in or zone in on the region that I want to select and isolate. Now, I can hit the T key in Pro Tools, and that's a quick key that will allow me to zoom in. So as I'm trying to identify this loud section and maybe separate it out, I can zoom in, and that allows me to see these transients in better detail, to see these spikes or these surges in volume, to know, okay, exactly where does this start getting loudest. So I'm going to guess we're getting louder about right in here, and then I'll zoom in. And once I get zoomed in, I want to get right up to the transient where the volume starts to surge. So in Pro Tools, I can go ahead and hit this tab key, and this is going to allow me to just continue to tab through until I get to the transient, right up against the transient that I want to actually split that track at. So to split the track, I can hit B, and now I've split this track into two parts. So I've got the start of that kick track. So I'm going to zoom out by hitting R, and I'm going to go to the other side of that multiple layer that I want to isolate. So this other side gives me the out point, or the point that I'm going to be kind of breaking the other side of this track. So I'll zoom back out by hitting R and just kind of eyeball where I'm at. So I know that's the general vicinity where, you know, the volume once again gets a little lower. So I'll hit T, and then I'll just go ahead and hit my tab to my transient, and I'll hit B to break it right there. And so now if I click on this broken clip that I have now, because I have two sides, an input and an output of where this is broken, I'll left click on that, and as you can see, I've now identified this part of this track that is louder than everything else that I really want to mult out and get on its own individual track, so I can adjust its volume level independently of the other parts. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new track. And to do that, I can go up to the file menu and go to track, new, and get the new tracks dialog box. And by default, it's set up to give me a mono track. Mono means one. So the track that we're working on is a mono track. So we'll make a new mono track. And it's an audio track, which is the same file type that we've been working on here. So I'll create that track. As you can see, I get this new track right underneath the old track. And then I'm just going to take this track and I'm going to left click it and pull it straight down. And you want to be careful not to shift this track when you pull it down, because this still needs to play from beginning to end. And if you shift it a little bit, the timing is going to be off. So make sure you shift it right down. Now I'm going to back up real quick and undo that by hitting Command Z on a Mac, Control Z on a Windows machine or a PC. Now, if you have a problem just pulling it down and having it, you know, stay lined up, you can hold down the Alt key and then drag it. And that is the equivalent of copying. So that allowed me to copy or make a duplicate of that clip. And when you copy, it will line up. It won't move. So then I can go in to the original track that was copied and delete it. Either approach is fine. Either just drag it down or Alt drag, but just make sure that that stays lined up. And then you want to name this new track that you made. Now, because it came from the kick, we'll call it Kick Mult 1. So, you know, helps us to recognize that this is just a multiple layer of this kick track. And it allowed us to bring, you know, this section that gets a little bit louder to its own track so that we can deal with its volume independently. So let's continue to look at this kick. As we can see, it has two other parts that kind of have their individual volume too. This part here kind of goes to this section right here. And then it starts to get loud right at that transient there. So I'm going to highlight that again. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. And I can see where the transient is, where it starts to get loud. So I'm going to tab to that transient right up against it, hit B to break it. And since it was already broken on its left side, now I can select that. And now that mult is ready to get pulled down to its own track. So again, I want to create another track and I want it to appear right under Kick Mult 1. So I'm going to select Kick Mult 1, and you can see that this track is now selected. And when you select the track and you make a new track, the new track is going to appear under the track that was selected. So now I'm going to go up to track, new, and once again, it's a mono audio track. I'm going to hit create. So now we have a new track, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this track straight down. So now I've got another mult, which has a little bit different volume as these other ones. I'm going to name it by double clicking on audio 1, naming it Kick Mult 2. Okay. And then I've got one final piece here, which is by itself. And I'll just go and select Kick Mult 2, create a new track. And then I'm going to drag this down and name this Kick Mult 3. Now, it's important to realize that even though these sections are on their own track, we still need to think about this kick as being one part. It's still one thing. So we're going to need the volume of each of these mults to be consistent. And that's why we multed this out, because if this kick part is playing here, then all of a sudden it gets to this louder part, there's going to be a surge in volume. So if I play this, matter of fact, I'm going to solo these kick parts by just hitting the S on each of the mults. And I'm just going to play this really quick. Okay, so we'll listen to that kick and watch when it overlaps here with the next part. So it gets a little bit louder there, just a little bit louder, but enough to where I want to make sure I turn down the volume of kick mult 1 so that it's not too much louder than the original kick. We want to have consistency. And then I can go to the end of kick mult 1 and listen to it as it goes into kick mult 2. Okay, and again, I may have to adjust the volume a bit just to make sure there's consistency. And then I would do the same thing by going over here to kick mult 3 and just making sure that is consistent. And it gets a little louder there between those two, so I can pull that volume down. And so you just want to, again, just listen to the sections as they overlap. And all I'm doing is I'm clicking up here in the ruler bar on this blue section. I'm just left clicking. And it's allowing me to move the song position really easy. And that's really the key, because again, you want to have a consistent volume from the beginning of the kick to the end of the kick. And multing is going to help you do that. So you have the option to kind of do that in these different parts that you feel are going to be a problem. So you have a snare where you can obviously see there's probably going to be a problem here, right? And really, it's most intense right in this middle section. The overheads, you have an intense section. So it's up to you to decide based on your workflow how much multing you want to do per track, and then deciding if you mult something out, how much are you going to mult out? If you mult the snare out, say this much of that snare, then there's still going to be an issue in this middle section. So you might have a scenario where you need to mult just this middle section out so you can deal with that volume on its own. Same thing with overhead 1 and overhead 2. Now, there are some tracks in the AMS All-Star that are pretty consistent. If you look at guitar 1, if you look at the bass, and if you look at guitar 2, for the most part, they're fairly consistent. So you might not have to do a lot of multing. And with guitar 1, I have to add, there is a solo somewhere towards the beginning of the song. So in those cases where an instrument has a solo, sometimes you might want to mult that solo out so that you can give that solo its own volume level so it can stand out in the mix more. So that's really the key to multing. And that's really kind of the first phase of us trying to get our balance together, making sure that each track is going to have a consistent level from beginning to end.